Cool Borders 3, when it released in 1998 for the PlayStation, would be developed by Idle Minds and published by 989 Studios, and would completely change its direction in terms of its gameplay aesthetics, visual presence, compared to the two earlier games on the system that was developed by Web Systems. So while essentially this game was a sequel, it felt completely different to the previous two entries, but still tried to continue on with the game's unique trends of giving players the chance to take part in different snowboarding events, from downhill Border X type championships, slalom events, half pipe events, slopestyle events, big air competitions, to try and gain the most amount of points and to finish tracks in the quickest amount of time possible. The game also removed the feature to use the multi-link cable that required two PlayStations so that you could play a non-split screen for the two-player mode, instead substituting it with a split screen mode. So you still had access to the multiplayer, but it just would be on the one system rather than needing two, which for many back then, while the system link feature was a pretty cool concept, it was very unethical for many people because it meant that you had to carry around another TV and another PlayStation and have another copy of the game available round to a friend's house in order to be able to play a multiplayer, which not everybody had access to or had the means to do back then. So by being able to play the game on split screen just meant you could gather around in the same room with your mates and just play it all in the one area, which was a lot more feasible and accessible to many. Cool Borders 3 would change many aspects compared to the previous two games. They would add in more characters, more unlockable features, tracks, different types of boards you could choose from, different types of environments, tracks, but the most noticeable difference is its visual aesthetics, as the game, being developed by a different company, completely changed up its graphical style, utilising a completely different game engine that somewhat moved away from the arcade aesthetics of that of the original, looking for a more realistic approach. As at this time, extreme sports games were starting to hit somewhat of a culture trend with regards to its popularity. Now, it would still take another year or so for the sport, and especially the trend within video games, to really explode, but this was definitely a turning point for the genre with regards to how games are being developed moving forward, as a lot of them were moving away from the arcade aesthetics to try and capitalise on more realistic approaches that would be more familiar with TV presentations. As a result, the game received above average reviews, which was higher than previously seen in other games in the series, mainly due to those reasons, as people liked the depth of the options that were available, making many of the features more accessible to many that you didn't have in the previous games. But while those features did stand out, for me personally, I can't help but feel that even though yes, it's a sequel, but it feels like a completely different game, because the control systems, while it is accessible and it is usable, it does iron out and take away a lot of the flaws that were seen in the original games. But I can't help but feel that the control systems, especially with Cool Borders 3 and even Cool Borders 4, even though that's an additional sequel, but it felt more of an add-on than an actual sequel. It felt almost identical to this, but it just felt like the control system with regards to how you move the characters on the boards, it just felt slower and sluggish. It didn't feel as fast paced as that of the previous two titles. But I suppose, like I said, they were going for a more realistic approach at that time with regards to the game's overall development and feature. They were trying to really move away from the arcade aesthetics. In many ways, yes, it is a sequel, but it feels like an entirely different franchise or set of games, but just with a popular brand name attached to it. But speaking of brand names, many of the boards that you could choose in the game were also endorsed by real life snowboarding brand companies as well, so I think that also helped with the selling appeal of the game too, as it appealed to true fans of the sport. But even in terms of the visuals, the game is nice to look at. It definitely is different compared to the previous games. It does have some nice visual features. There's a lot more detail with regards to some of the environments that you're in. There's a lot more obstacles overall to try and avoid. Just the moves in many ways can be a little bit more difficult to pull off, especially when you look at it compared to Cool Borders 2 in many respects. But it's still a decent title for what it does try to do. This and Cool Borders 4 in many ways felt like the exact same game, while there was some subtle tweaks to it, but it just felt essentially the same. Cool Borders 2001, which would be the last game to be released on the PlayStation, in the series itself. It felt more like a step up. While it still had similar visual preferences, the control systems was definitely a lot more refined. It felt a lot more fluid and moved a lot faster, and just felt like you had a lot more control over various dynamics and features. This game, however, would just take a little bit more time to get used to, but once you got into it, it was a fun game. For me personally, my first experience with this game more particularly was when later on, when we had our first PlayStation growing up, we did have it modified so that it allowed us to play games from other regions. I think that's how many of us usually got to play games. So you'd end up finding games in like different marketplaces, some games that you couldn't even get anywhere else from other regions. You were able to get copies of them, and that's how I ended up getting a copy of this, and I got it fairly cheap at the time. And it was the original American release as well, which was crazy too. And the instant difference was that the American release, because with it being NTSC, the gameplay definitely felt a lot faster. So it did, compared to titles you would have been familiar with. So even back then, that was relatively a new thing for us as well, as you weren't used to seeing games being played at a faster pace. So that in itself added a unique appeal to the game in many ways. But I will admit, I did struggle back then to figure out what to do. I actually found it harder to get into Cool Borders 3 than I did with 2, and 2 still took me a while. But when I look back at it, while it is a good game and having spent time playing it and putting time into it more specifically, it is a decent title, but I prefer the second one. If I was to pick a favourite in the series, I would have to pick the second one. Yes, there is a lot of flaws in that game, but I don't know, I think it's just the arcade aesthetics and the visual appeal, and even the fast paced elements to the game, because it definitely feels a lot faster overall. For me, it just was a lot more fun. This game, I found myself just getting frustrated a lot more with it. Even now, going back to playing it years later, while you were able to get the hang of it after a while, there was just certain elements of it that you just struggled with, because you do need to put a lot of time into this, and your button combinations for pulling off tricks and your timing has to be perfect in order for it to work. And if you don't do that, you will mess everything up. But I suppose that just adds to the appeal of it, really, at the end of the day. Like at this stage in 1998, we were already into the third entry of the series, and like many other popular franchises, we're already starting to see many sequels. So this genre was starting to become very, very popular, and the fact is that in 1998 saw the third entry in Cool Borders, in the Cool Borders series, was starting to prove that the Extreme Sports franchise or series in itself was starting to really gain in popularity. But it would later explode later on that year, and more specifically in 1999 and early 2000, that would see tons of games being released on the system, which I will cover on more videos on the channel at a future date. But aside from that, I would love to know your thoughts of this third entry in the Cool Borders series, and what do you think of it overall? Did you like this drastic change in terms of its gameplay style and aesthetics, or do you prefer the visual style of the original two titles in the series? Which one of the games would be your favourite overall? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you have enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to be updated of future content. And if you would like to see more videos around other types of snowboarding games or extreme sports titles released on the PlayStation, then you can check out this playlist on screen to see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.